Good morning.
It is great to have you back, folks who didn't catch us last week. Our regular co-host Matt Lewis is still plugging away on his book Too Dumb to Fail. But Alexis Levinson, campaign correspondent for National Review magazine, graciously gave us some time on the trail last week to give us the scoop from Iowa. Now, where are you in New Hampshire right now?
I'm in Bedford, New Hampshire, so basically Manchester, like 20 minutes
Okay.
outside.
Folks don't know the New Hampshire map. Manchester is probably the biggest campaign hub, southeast corner of the state, somewhat close to Boston. And you see a lot of campaign activity around there and around Concord. I am in Western Mass. I'm close to the southwest corner of New Hampshire in Keene. I always like to go up to New Hampshire and check out what's going on, but uh, I there's not that much Republican activity in Keene. I mean, they kind of touch it from time to time, but it's more of a college town, more of a Democratic town, and not as many Republican votes out there. That's my understanding, at least. I take it from where you are. You feel that's where the Republican votes are generally found.
I mean, Manchester is, my understanding of the state is just that Manchester area is sort of the most populous area of the state. The northern, they kind of sometimes venture up to the North Country, which is the very northern part of the state, but every time you go up there, you sort of read these stories about how these towns used to be these bustling tourist centers with ski places and all of that, and that all of a sudden, especially this year where there's been very little snow, they're in dire straits. Dixville Notch, which is the place that has the very first, they may have been replaced this year actually. But it, historically has been the place that has the very first primary votes. There are like 6 people in the entire town.
Right.
So, there are a lot less populous areas of the state, and this is kind of one of the population centers.
Now, before I go deep into New Hampshire, can you briefly tell us what was Iowa caucus night like?
Ooh, whirlwind. Not the least of which because there was an impending snowstorm that was going to probably have none of us be able to get out of there. But it was interesting. I was at Rubio's election night HQ, so at his victory party, and that was, I mean, that was really the place to be that night. He was, at least I thought he was the story of the night. Ted Cruz, it panned out how he wanted, and that was great, and we all sort of expected that was coming. But Rubio was sort of the surprise victory, and that party had the feel of a victory party, even though he came in third.
Now, the sense was that Cruz won because he had a sophisticated ground game, and Trump performed below expectations of the polls because he did not have a ground game. Rubio was known to kind of drop in, hit the media centers, not to the whole 99 county thing that Cruz did, and his vote was around the metro areas. Was your sense that did he have a secret ground game, or did he just get away with being a media presence in that area and being the most obvious alternative to the hard right choices?
I think it was a little bit of both. I think Rubio did what every candidate desperately wants to do, which is he peaked at the exact right time. He all of a sudden that final week had a surge. And I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, and apologies because I've been traveling a lot and my brain is a little wobbly, but that there were people kind of in the last couple days who actually switched from Cruz to Rubio or Trump to Rubio. He had his moment at exactly the moment you want to have your moment, and that really helped. And then also, like, they did something right. I mean, we gave them all a lot of trouble for, you're only campaigning in the population centers, you're relying really heavily on paid media, on ads, on him being on TV a lot. And they said all along, we think we get Marco Rubio in front of more voters when we put him on TV. Like, we just do. We get him in front of more voters that way than we do putting him in a town hall. We're not going to take him to these small towns where you have 10 people. And Sean Gallitz at CBS, actually, who's their Rubio embed, did this really interesting map of where Rubio had traveled the final week. And he hit, if you look at it, it lines up exactly with the counties that Romney won really aggressively in 2012. They followed a very clear map. They went to the places where Romney won, where they thought they could have a really strong showing, and they skipped, kind of everywhere else. And it worked out for them. Like, I think I said this last week, we were either going to say they were brilliant or this was campaign malpractice. Turns out they were probably pretty brilliant.
So does that then translate into New Hampshire? So you have a different situation in New Hampshire where,
very different.
Jeb and Christie and Kasich, who did not campaign heavily in Iowa in the last month, they have made a much bigger stand in New Hampshire. They're polling better in New Hampshire. They're all kind of clustered around 10. There's some evidence of a Rubio bump coming out of Iowa where I saw one poll where he was at 18 in New Hampshire and also polling very strong nationally. But people thought in 2008, for example, that Obama had this big wave coming out of New Hampshire that was coming out of Iowa that was going to carry him through, and the polling was very strong. And then Hillary got a late break. She had an emotional moment. Obama was a little too rough in the New Hampshire debate, and that caused some backlash. We're taping now on Friday. Republicans have a debate Saturday night, so we don't know what's going to happen there yet. And already, Christie is laying into Rubio hard for lacking any accomplishments, and that's being backed up by various Bush Super PAC right to rise ads. You've only been, I don't know how long you've been in New Hampshire exactly, but is there any kind of feeling on the ground? Is the feeling that, man, there's a Rubio freight train coming through, or is there a feeling of, okay, I feel the resistance coming up, and then Rubio's got something to prove here?
I think it's a little bit of both. Certainly there is momentum for him. How long I've been in New Hampshire, I finally got here at 5 p.m. yesterday after a lot of flight delays. So my experience comes from a single Jeb Bush event with Barbara Bush so far. Mm-hmm. But what I will say is that the NBC poll that came out this morning that we all saw the results of last night when they embargoed it, Rubio's at 17%, which puts him in a very clear second place behind Trump. Ted Cruz is at 15%. And then there's a big drop down. Kasich's at 10%. Bush is at 9%. And Christie, who's been lashing out all week, as you said, he's at 4%. So Christie actually seems to be really not having a good time here. I do think, there's been a lot of, all of them are doing this thing where they're saying, Christie's line was, Rubio's the boy in the bubble. Jeb yesterday was talking about, this, he called them out by name. He said, Trump, I'm not going to say anything more on that. And then he said, there are these two freshman senators and one of them is a very close friend, but nothing they have done in the past should give us any reason to think they are capable of making the tough decisions president needs to make. There's a real effort to cast his inexperience. I actually thought the most damaging thing that did that was the Rick Santorum clip where he can't quite name an accomplishment of Rubio. And Rubio brushed that off. Ad. Right. And that's a good ad. That's very damning. And Rubio brushed it off as, well, he's been running his own campaign. He hasn't been paying attention to my record. But, he endorsed you. He should have, he has to have been paying attention to something. What are you basing it on? Because otherwise... Why
are you putting him on TV if he's not prepared for it?
Right. And, I would say from a, very insidery perspective, a lot of Rick Santorum endorsing Marco Rubio probably had to do with anybody but Ted Cruz. There's no love lost there. The Santorum and Huckabee folks really feel like Cruz stepped in to be the quote-unquote conservative, and they feel like he's just not conservative, and that he's, really appropriated this label that he does not deserve. And there's a lot of animosity there. So...
Well, this is always my argument that why conservatives can't beat the establishment because they always splinter. And this seems to be an example. Here you have Santorum, who was the conservative firebrand trying to stop Romney. He's mad at Cruz, so he goes with Rubio, who's now an establishment pick. Now, obviously, I've stuck my neck out saying it was going to be Jeb, and that may not prove true depending on what happens in New Hampshire. But the underlying point that the establishment wins the day because conservatives can't unify, that does seem to be bearing out.
Yeah. What was interesting, speaking of establishment, and not to change the subject, but at this Jeb event last night, it was the first event that Barbara Bush has been at with him since he announced his campaign. And the thing I was very struck by, and I don't cover Jeb regularly, so, the embeds may be seeing something different, but I was really struck by the fact that that Jeb got up there and he said, I figured this out. I'm establishment because I'm Barbara Bush's son. I embrace that every day. I'm proud of my father. I'm proud of my brother. Like, I am proud to be a Bush. And he said that, and I sort of, that is the big knock on Bush's candidacy. There are a lot of big knocks on Bush's candidacy at this point, but, coming in, that's always been the big one, has been, you cannot run for president as a Bush in 2016. And he's just, for lack of any better option, he's really owning it. And I thought that was very interesting that he was like, I'm establishment, bring it on.
Now, I feel like on media Twitter, I have a Twitter column
where we all live, yes.
Right. So I have a column that on my tweet deck that's all journalists. I feel like the general tenor towards Jeb is extremely high school. It's let's pick on poor sissy Jeb. He's so pathetic. Every little, he hugs a voter who says he's going to vote for him. Oh, Jeb, you're so sad. There's a whole please clap thing that came out because it was a kicker of a New York Times piece. There was a moment of silence after a random visit at a town hall. He said, please clap. People clapped. And the video came out. And I see little dribs and drabs of people like, hey, I was there. That was actually funny. It was not sad. It was a joke and everybody got it. But the image you get is, poor, sweet, sad Jeb. You're in the room at a Jeb town hall. Is that the vibe there, or is he connecting?
I mean, as you say that we kind of make fun of Jeb a little, I am probably guilty of this. The piece I wrote after the Jeb thing, and this is not entirely Jeb's fault, was these are the weird things that happen at the Jeb town hall. And again, not Jeb's fault. He had a guy begin a question with, this year the New Hampshire primary aligns with the Chinese New Year. And this was, of course, an opening to, let's talk about your China foreign policy, but, necessary precursor. And there was another guy who said, our moose population is declining about 50% this year. And then handed Jeb a stuffed animal moose, which I gather will go to one of the grandkids. But, there was one point where Jeb he makes some odd jokes about his mom and, apparently this is a normal part of his routine. He says, she's not as nice, she's not as great as everyone thinks she is. And I'm always so happy that I always tell her, like, she's lucky there was no child abuse hotline to call when she was bringing us up because she was in charge of the discipline. And he said something about someone asked about, like, labeling non-GMO foods. And he said, on Sunday when I go home, I do a lot of the shopping. I love looking at the labeling. We all thought that we're like, you do love looking at the labeling, don't you? Okay. Weird. I've talked to some friends who have covered him more regularly than I have. Weird stuff just seems to follow him. Like, he is a weird guy with a weird sense of humor. That says nothing about, that is not saying anything about whether he would be a good president or whether he's qualified. Just, the affect is a little bit odd. And he, I think probably to his credit, seems to be owning it. This is him. He's an awkward dude, and he just he's gonna go do Jeb. And
it's also fairly.
Well, I kind of think that's maybe like a better idea than trying, for a while he tried to kind of be everything but Jeb. And now he seems to really be just totally on it.
So, I mean, you see on the Democratic side this sort of generational split. Young voters are excited about Bernie, and older voters have more Clinton. Older voters have more Clinton nostalgia, more acceptance of the pragmatist argument, that sort of thing. Rubio has tried very hard to play a generational card. I'm the future, my opponents are the past. He'll say explicitly Hillary's the past. He more implicitly says, Jeb and others are the past. But the Republican electorate, primary electorate, is older than the Democratic primary electorate. And so in New Hampshire, do you sense in that room, is there Bush nostalgia? When you bring Barbara Bush out, do people like that? There's going to be now an ad that's going to air in South Carolina that features George W. Bush. Is there an appetite for that in the Republican primary, or do they have a similar hunger for the fresh face?
I have two thoughts on this. One, yes, I think last night's event, there was very evident Bush nostalgia. I mean, Barbara Bush was the star of that show. Everyone walked onto the stage, or it was cafeteria, so not a stage, but everyone walked into the Beach Boys' Barbara Ann, and they walked off to the Beach Boys' Barbara Ann. So if there was any question about who the star of that show was, it was made abundantly clear. There were a couple people who sort of started their questions as, oh, I love your mom. Oh, I really want to take a photo with your mom. Like, some guy I think may have said something to the effect of, I have a crush on your mom. So, like, there is Bush nostalgia. People, I gather from the embeds, this was a big crowd for him. I think a lot of that was to see the matriarch of the Bush family. My other thought is my colleague Tim Alberta a few months ago wrote a really great piece about this age factor, that you really can't write Jeb off in New Hampshire because New Hampshire does, as you said, have a lot of the vote in New Hampshire comes from older voters. They are very high propensity voters, and he is owning that. He's very much catering to that age group, and that he wrote this, I want to say, late last year. When we were really all writing Jeb off, and you really can't write Jeb off because he is making that appeal very clearly, and Rubio maybe is not so much. Rubio's really trying to be the young guy. And he's
although I hear people say Rubio is what an old person thinks a young person should sound like, so perhaps that would have appeal to older voters.
Right. Maybe it is, but it's interesting to me that, yes, Jeb is making this appeal to older voters, and this would be the place to make it.
Now, Christie, and you touched on this earlier, Christie is attacking Rubio the most ferociously as the boy in the bubble. I mean, he gets into this very New Hampshire specific argument that Rubio's town halls are not very long, and he doesn't answer very many questions. He gives his canned speech every single time, and he needs to throw away the script and prove that he's a more complete candidate if he's actually going to earn this vote. Christie sort of sounds like he's trying to be the voice of the New Hampshire town hall citizen. I know you haven't been there for that long, but do you see any kind of sense that New Hampshire voters are expecting Rubio to be put through his paces now, or do they just like seeing him? He has a polished stump, and they feel like that, and that's going to be good enough.
I had someone say to me, and this is someone who ended up endorsing another candidate, who said, I liked Rubio. I went to his events. I really wanted to like him. And I came away feeling like this is a guy who actively is trying not to make news. He wants the news to be that he showed up. He doesn't want the news to be that he said anything. And this guy seemed very irked by that. That is not the New Hampshire way. The New Hampshire way is really to do it the way Christie is doing it. But that said, Christie's been living up here, and Christie had his moment, and he may have had his moment too soon, but it can't just be that you spent the most time up here. That's not going to get anyone anywhere, especially when it's not just Christie who spent all this time up here. Kasich did the exact same thing.
I'll say this about 2008. I actually went to see an Edwards event and an Obama event in the weekend before the New Hampshire primary. We didn't get to see Hillary. And at the Obama event, it was late at night. It was the last stop on his day. The crowd, it was a packed crowd. And Obama came in, and I'm sort of mad. This is before iPhone, so no one was recording the video. I've tried to find the video on C-SPAN or YouTube. I can't find anywhere. But I feel like it was probably the last type of this Obama speech that he ever gave, because it was so it didn't go. I think it would find the room, but obviously it didn't help him win the primary. It was a extremely cocky speech. He was like Muhammad Ali talking about all the people he's beaten, and it wasn't and just as proof that he can win things, and it wasn't about what he wanted to do at all. It didn't get into any kind of policy. It didn't get any kind of. It didn't. It wasn't a town hall. He wasn't. He was. I think he should have hit a lot of spots and give a stump and move on, thinking he could ride a wave. And that clearly New Hampshire voters said, "Hold on, guy. Not so fast. We're not ready to have you run away with this whole thing." Now, just because that's the Democratic psychology in 2008 doesn't mean it's Republican psychology today. But if Rubio's not leaning forward here and playing cautiously, I could see the risk in that.
Yeah, and again, I really think this has been a knock on Rubio all along, that he is a little bit too scripted. He he goes, he drives reporters crazy. He goes out of his way not to make news. And he, there'll be a crisis of the day and he does not address it. He just does not go there. I vividly remember right after the Charleston church shooting, he spoke at, I want to say it was the Faith and Freedom, one of those at the Marriott, or not the Marriott, one of those at the Omni Showroom in DC. And he spoke on the same day as Rand Paul and Ted Cruz. And both of them, mentioned the shooting, had a moment of silence, and Rubio was the only one who didn't mention it. And a couple of people actually wrote that up. And that's not unusual for him. He just does not do news of the day. He does not immediately react. He waits. He takes a beat. And that's partly what makes him a good candidate, that he does wait and take that beat. And he's very, very, very disciplined. But I think sometimes that maybe comes through to voters, that he's trying so hard to not actually say anything wrong that sometimes it seems like he's not saying anything at all. Not to disparage his stump speech, which of course, touches on a lot of things. But, I think for some of the more informed New Hampshire voters who are the people who go and see these guys regularly, and there are a lot of them, or at least there are a lot of them that I talk to, that's sort of that can be an off-putting sentiment.
So do you have a sense yet, we talked a lot last week about Iowa ground game. Obviously, Jeb, Christie, Kasich, they're all saying they have ground game. They've camped out there. They've lined up local endorsements. They're ready to go. Trump, again, has put little emphasis on field. Cruz is not looking to win New Hampshire, probably. He's eyeing South Carolina and then the so-called SEC primary states, the southern states in March. That's where he feels he'll clean up. There's obviously a risk that Jeb, Christie, Kasich, undercut each other. But is there one? Do you have a sense of how good that Jeb, Christie, Kasich ground game is? And is there any Rubio ground game? Has he put in that emphasis here, or is he trying to thread the needle like Iowa again?
Yeah, I think with ground game, I am always wary of making predictions, and we're going to see. Trump, his campaign manager is from here. He's a longtime New Hampshire operative. I wonder if that maybe makes it slightly better. But we're going to see. This is, in fairness, this is slightly less of this has a lot to do with ground game. You have to get bodies to the polls. But this is a different game, as you said, than Iowa. This is not a caucus state. This is a primary state. People just have to show up and drop a ballot in the box and good to go. You don't sit there. I went to a caucus and it was not less than an hour, as so many people had promised me. It was about an hour and 45 minutes, maybe 2 hours. So this is a different beast. But I just think we're going to see. I think a lot of it right now is coming to momentum because it's a primary state. I think Trump has been in the lead here forever. And I don't think anyone expects that him losing in Iowa is going to take him out of the lead. That said, could eat into his lead. That seems likely. Rubio clearly has the momentum. Cruz has momentum that he shot up to the top of the polls. And I think he's maybe spent 10 days in this state in the past until this week. He spent 10 days here in the past year. This has not been a place he's really campaigned because it's theoretically not the place that's where the electorate is favorable to him. So we're going to see. I do know Kasich and Christie are making huge pushes to kind of get a lot of people out here and really kind of drag bodies out the door.
Now, I'm very dismissive of Trump. I've always been dismissive of Trump, but he has led New Hampshire polls by a lot for a long time. We haven't really seen that much data since Iowa, so we don't know if that's really holding. There was a piece in the New York Times today that the anti-immigration message sells amongst New Hampshire Republicans. And so you just got the Scott Brown endorsement, Scott Brown, who fled Massachusetts to run for Senate in New Hampshire. And I once, I wrote a piece way back when, criticizing Ann Coulter, because Coulter wrote a book, I think it was Adios America, which, was saying how Republicans should double down on being anti-immigration. And she cited, and her argument was that, the liberals want Republicans for you to cave on immigration and claim it's for electoral reasons, but the white working class wants you to be anti-immigration, and that's the real swing vote. And I argue it's actually not a real swing vote; it's decidedly Republican. And she had cited Scott Brown as evidence of her point, and my point was that Scott Brown lost. So in a year that lots of Republicans won, other Republicans in swing states won, like Cory Gardner, who didn't take an anti-immigrant tax. So why hold up Scott Brown as an example of your point, who came up short? But to the extent that she's correct, we're not in a general election, we're in a Republican primary. And you don't even need to win 50% of the Republican voters to win the primary. So is there enough of a faction of anti-immigrant voters who would show up regardless of ground game? Is that ferment there from as far as you can tell?
So again, I've been on the ground less than 24 hours, but I don't think we can stress enough how different ground game is as an entity when it's a primary instead of a caucus. This is just such a different ballgame. People will show, this is, and I said this last time, when it's just voting, there's a lot of societal pressure to get out the door and go to the polls. This is a quick, 30-minute thing. In DC, it's really not, but theoretically, this is a quick, short thing. And you do it because you're supposed to do it. And I think there's a significantly less, I think ground game is obviously very important and, everyone's door knocking, even though it's snowing here. But this is not the same thing as Iowa. This is not like Ted Cruz is not going to have leaps and bounds ahead because he's invested so much time in his ground game here. A lot of this is going to just be momentum and popularity and who people like and who people saw their ads and that kind of thing. The usual, that kind of basic usual stuff.
Now, one of the quirks of New Hampshire is that independents can vote in the party primaries. They could go vote in the Republican primary. They could go vote in the Democratic primary. I mean, they can't do both, but they got to choose. But they can go either way. McCain won New Hampshire back in 2000 on the strength of the independent voters there. And so there's been a longstanding assumption that the New Hampshire independent is more of a moderate. And certainly you see John Kasich, I'd say Kasich, Christie, and Bush are all having certain messages that might surprise people who've been listening to Republicans for so long. I heard Jeb Bush at that town hall last night. I was listening to C-SPAN say that climate change is happening, and he wasn't embracing Obama's prescription for it, but he said if we don't adapt to the reality of a changing climate, we're going to have serious repercussions. Chris Christie is hitting Rubio for being too anti-abortion, which is something you never hear Republicans say in almost any other state. But Rubio's made pretty clear that he would sign legislation that had no exceptions at all, even for rape and incest. Chris is trying to make a point of that, saying, and I heard Lindsey Graham make that point on behalf of Bush, that this is a bad general election message. Like he'll get killed in the general election with that message. And so theoretically, New Hampshire independents might not be put off by that argument. But you also have the Trump factor here where, Trump's always pulled well with independents. There are right-leaning anti-immigrant independents out there. Is there any kind of scuttlebutt who that breaks well for? Is there a candidate who is poised to capture the independent vote? And will they even, or will those independents go vote for Bernie in the Democrat branch? Not sure with the Republican side. I mean, does anyone know where they're going to go?
I think there are, everyone. I mean, I think the problem with New Hampshire is that, 4 of them are making a play for the independent vote. This is why Christie and Kasich have camped up out here. This is why Jeb ultimately kind of decided to ignore Iowa. This is a very favorable state for people who are making an electability argument, who are making a experience argument, and who are basically sort of more moderate centrist versions of Republicans. Kasich got this New York Times endorsement that's the most, I don't know if you read it, it's about the most backhanded compliment I've ever seen. It's Republicans are terrible, and if we have to choose one, I guess John Kasich is kind of the only one we can possibly choose. But this is, and nowhere else, in no other state would a Republican in a Republican primary stand up and be like, I got the New York Times endorsement. And this might be the one state where that would help him. I mean, that's really the demographics of the state, the people who vote, the New York Times endorsement might actually be a big thing. And that is the problem, is that they all want this independent vote. They all want this moderate vote. And there's a reason that we're talking about a completely different group of people than we were talking about 3 days ago. We are certainly talking about Trump, Cruz, and Rubio, but really we're talking about Rubio, Christie, Kasich, Jeb. And there's a reason only Rubio is the only one who crosses over, and that's because Rubio's really been trying to straddle this line. But as you said, like the abortion thing, he's going to tie himself into knots over that. And the question is just if he can kind of be the likable guy and kind of momentum his way through all of those things.
No, it was the ABC debate 4 years ago where Romney got tripped up on the contraception question, which ties into views of right to privacy and Roe v. Wade. George Stephanopoulos asked him that question. Republicans were livid at Stephanopoulos ever since. Saturday's debate is an ABC debate. Isn't Stephanopoulos? I haven't gone to check.
I haven't looked. What I will say is, this has been the big push that the RNC has made this year. It may be Republicans, but it's also IJ Review. Mary Catherine Ham is going to be on the panel. I think the whole point, I think what they're going for with this is I actually think the Stephanopoulos debate is exactly what they've been trying to avoid this entire year. And there have obviously been a lot of mess ups along the way, but they're, and CNBC, I think they feel was the big screw up of the cycle, but it was not George Stephanopoulos asking a question about contraception. And I think they feel like Republicans don't think they feel like that's a general election question, not a Republican primary question. And as I've said before, I have slightly different feelings on what debates are for, as opposed to let's present all of our candidates in the best light possible. I think that's kind of ridiculous. But, this is what the RNC's job is to protect the Republican Party, to protect their candidates, and they feel like they need to avoid having that happen again.
I'm trying to find who the moderator is while I'm listening to you. I'm failing so far. If I pick it up, I'll grab it.
I would be willing to bet money that the RNC did not agree to a debate where George Stephanopoulos is the moderator.
I would imagine
I may lose money on this, but I feel fairly certain that they, under no circumstances, would let him moderate a debate again. I think they felt very burned by that last year.
Well, but even if it's not him, it's not Fox. And I think the Fox debates, the Fox News debates, I think have been properly inquisitive. The Fox Business debates, perhaps less so. I would agree with that. But ABC certainly is not, a Republican organ. So we could well see that kind of abortion question come up. And I think you'd be hard pressed to say that was out of bounds for a moderator to bring up, especially when Chris Christie and a Bush surrogate, Lindsey Graham, are directly making the point. So you might well see Rubio have to explain again how he can hold that position and be a viable general election candidate.
Right, but I think the only reason that question will now be maybe acceptable to get asked is because other Republican candidates have brought it up, and they will probably have to play the clip. I don't know. I clearly have some angst about how the Republican debates are being run, because I think the whole point is you should force candidates to run the gauntlet, and that we should not be sitting there being like, oh no, don't make them answer anything that Republican primaries voters wouldn't care about. Don't make this about the general election, because certainly this is not about the general election. Of course, no, we just want to get through the primary. We don't possibly want to win an election. But this is my own little pet peeve, apparently.
So both the RNC and the DNC have took over. The RNC took over their debates first, and the DNC followed suit. If they can do it, we can do it. So you think that's a big mistake on the RNC's part, from a political standpoint, or from a media standpoint?
I am probably biased because National Review got kicked out of a debate, or kicked off a sponsorship of the debate because of the editorial that the editors wrote about Trump, and that's probably pretty reasonable. You probably shouldn't have someone on the stage that actively is against a single candidate on the stage. But I don't know. I think the idea that everything should be kid glove is a little unreasonable. I do think it's fair to make sure that you're not turning this into a bunch of gotcha questions. I do think it shouldn't be about moderators really going on the attack against candidates. And, I don't blame the RNC for trying to kind of organize that. I really think the whole point of having a debate is to say, run the gauntlet, can you handle it? And I think the debates that have been so highly praised on the Republican side, which have been the Fox Business ones, really don't force them to do that. I think the Fox Business ones have been, so this is the best part of your stump speech. Would you like to expand on that? And I just think that's stupid. I don't think that serves anybody. You can go watch their stump speeches on the internet. You don't need to give them a bunch of airtime on primetime TV to deliver them all over again.
So you're correct. Moderators are Martha Raddatz and David Muir, as well as New Hampshire WMUR anchor Josh McElveen and Mary Catherine Ham. Mary Catherine Ham, who has been on this show before. So let me be self-promoting and turn the spotlight on myself for a second. And also on the Democrats, because I had a couple pieces in Politico this week exploring the divide that it has manifested out of Iowa. One piece talked about that specifically. You have an ideological divide, a generational divide that showed up in the Iowa entrance poll. Bernie just swept the under 30 vote, and Clinton did very strongly in the older vote. We've had bitter primaries before. 2008 was not a pretty primary for Democrats, but everybody got together at the end of the day. My argument in the piece was, and it got titled Hillary's "She's a Liar" problem, which is not really a question that gets cropped up about, is she trustworthy? It's that when she was giving her remarks in Iowa after that quasi-victory speech, and she said, "I'm a progressive," at the Bernie event, people started spontaneously chanting, "She's a liar." So that, to me, crystallized the ideological gulf that has manifested. And my opinion is that ideology is a harder bridge to heal after a primary is over than mere personal attacks. Hillary and Obama, they had some substantive differences, but a lot of it was about style, a lot of it was about demographic, and the actual policy positions of the two of them weren't that far apart, so it wasn't that hard to bridge the gap afterwards. Bernie is essentially saying about Hillary that, and he tries to be a little, sotto voce about it, but basically she's a tool of Wall Street. She gets money from Wall Street. She can't affect change. She's part of a rotten system that we have to smash through political revolution. Now, Bernie has said, "I will endorse the Democratic winner," so that to diffuse the question of whether he's not a real Democrat or not. And he may well go on the stump for her, as far as I know. But that's a pretty hard sell to a young voter who's been agitated and animated around Bernie's message, to then suddenly say, "Yeah, I told you she's totally bought by Wall Street, but go vote for her anyway." That, to me, it's potentially difficult. Now, it may be that the vast majority of Bernie supporters still vote for her, but and you could go. You have examples for 1992, Clinton and Tsongas. It wasn't Clinton being unpalatable to the left. It was more about people in the middle who thought Clinton wasn't serious about deficit reduction. Those Tsongas voters that didn't like Clinton flocked to Perot, but same thing happened on the Republican side, so it didn't hurt Clinton at the end of the day. 2000, Ralph Nader didn't get that many votes. It was less than 3 million nationally. It was only 97,000 in Florida, but it was enough in a very close race to make, the Nader folks will say, well, the race was stolen by the Supreme Court, not Nader's fault. Sure, but it was a lot closer. It was more stealable because he was there. So you don't know how many Bernie voters does Hillary have to lose, assuming she's the nominee, for things to get very interesting in November. And I had a second piece that explored what real socialists are saying about Bernie, because there's a lot of divide there. There's socialist parties with their own candidates. The Socialist Party USA has their own candidate. Workers' World has their own candidate. There are certain socialist groups like Socialist Alternative and Democratic Socialists of America, which are supporting Bernie and are going to ride Bernie for as long as he goes. But the big dog here is the Green Party, which is what Ralph Nader ran on in 2000. They haven't done as well since then because a lot of backlash came towards them after that. But Jill Stein, who's the likely Democratic candidate, I spoke with her. She is primed to pitch Bernie voters as soon as he loses and say to them, this political revolution that he's talking about, political revolutions that start in the Democratic Party, die in the Democratic Party. If you want the revolution to live, we're your only hope. And the only reason why the divide among socialists, I think, matters is it's an open question. How many ballots does Jill Stein get on? She got on 36 last time, which was not as much as what Ralph Nader got on last time. Ralph Nader got on 43. Once you cross 40, it seems a little more like you're a full-blown national candidate. I think if you're under 40, that gets a little bit harder to sell. And so she wants to get as much as possible. There's a guy named Howie Hawkins who ran for governor in New York under the Green Party banner. He's a professed socialist. Now, Greens aren't technically socialists, but there are socialist ties, and Jill Stein is actively wooing. She already has an endorsement from one socialist group, the International Socialist Organization, so she's not shying away from that. Howie Hawkins has said to Socialist Alternative and Democratic Socialist, you are sapping our resources by focusing on Bernie. We need you to get Jill Stein on as many ballots as possible. Jill Stein is saying, it's all going to work out. We're ahead of the game where we were last time. We got more money. We're going to have federal matching funds. We're in good shape. But we don't know yet. So there is I think an open concern increasing among Democrats who are seeing the fight get more and more pointed that young voters who have never lived really under a Republican president, not when they were really paying attention, voters who were babies when Nader 2000 happened, who aren't as unnerved at the possibility of Hillary losing. And once you internalize, Hillary is just as bad as a Republican. She is part of the problem. She's a tool of Wall Street. How hard will it be to keep those young voters in the fold in November?
Yeah, I was really struck. I was sitting in the Kansas City airport trying to get out of Iowa, which was a saga. But I was sitting there with a couple guys who worked for MoveOn.org who at, 7 in the morning as our flight's being delayed are sitting there calculating. They were analytics guys, and they had flown out because MoveOn.org backed Bernie. And they were doing the math on how likely it was that there were 6 precincts where the result was decided by coin toss because it was an exact tie, and Hillary won all 6, apparently. And, they're running the math, and they're doing the numbers, and they're like, there is no chance this is not voter fraud. This is, totally, this has to have been rigged. The odds are just so low that this could happen naturally. And I was just so struck by kind of how quickly it went there and kind of the level of animosity that seems to be between these two camps. Because, at the end of the day, I assume if Bernie loses, he will stand up and say, look, I ran a hard race. I'm really glad that she's adopted some of my ideas. And, whatever you think about her compared to me, you got to know that compared to all the Republicans, she is far and away the better choice. And I sort of assume that's where we end up. But you're right. There is a really, really intense amount of dislike there. And I don't know how you overcome it.
Well, yeah, and the conspiracy theories clearly make the job harder. The more Bernie supporters feel that it was a rigged game, feeds into the Green Party argument. And when I talked to Jill Stein, she was already talking about that. She's like, we already see the Democratic Party, they withheld Bernie's access to his voter data. She is very willing to make those points and tell those voters, the Democratic Party does not want you. They don't want this revolution. They want to kill it, and you should, and it's not your home. I don't
think the Democratic Party does want this revolution. Or at least not, the DNC. I think that's a totally honest statement. That said, I do think there's totally an argument, and again, I don't cover this, so this is just reading things, but, there really does seem to be an argument that the debates were rigged to try and help Hillary, or that the debates were designed in a way to help Hillary and have there be fewer and whatnot. But, voter fraud because there were 6 coin flips, that to me, and it was 7 a.m., I hadn't slept, but that seems like a big leap that you're sitting there and being like, man, it was a tie and there has to have been voter fraud because there could not possibly be a tie. There was a tie.
No,
I don't know why we automatically go to, voter fraud.
Well, you may not have seen this because you were in transit, but there was a Des Moines Register editorial yesterday. The title was "Something Smells in the Democratic Party," which directly challenged how they ran the caucus and are not being transparent in reviewing the results. And that article has torn through, Bernie Facebook and Bernie Twitter, because it validates all the conspiracy theorizing. Now, it's very possible something went wrong, more likely due to amateurism than conspiracy. But anything that feeds that notion that Bernie did not lose fair and square is going to be an incentive for people to bolt the party.
I'm not totally convinced that I don't know, and I'm not the best person to answer this because maybe I just haven't been paying closely enough attention in last elections. I think ultimately people come home. I think ultimately I think if Hillary's the nominee, Bernie Sanders stands up and says she is the best possible choice we have and you guys have to vote for her. And I think maybe more importantly than Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren stands up and says, this is the woman that we need in charge. And, you may not like everything she stands for, but if we put her in there, she will listen to us. And I assume Hillary will make a huge show of saying, offering Bernie a cabinet position or saying Bernie's going to, I think she said this last night, that she said the first person I will call if I get the nomination will be Bernie Sanders. She's really making an effort to say
this is
she'll
where things might get
them.
very, very interesting come convention time. Because yes. I think still the conventional wisdom, which I would subscribe to, is that Hillary gets the nomination. She wins most of the states. But Bernie, with this very firm youth base, will still pick up delegates. And he has plenty of money and no real incentive to drop out early if he's still collecting delegates. He wants to have as many delegates as he can to make a stand at the convention for his message and his platform and to say that he is the heart of the party, which would be very akin to what happened in 1980 when Ted Kennedy went after Jimmy Carter. Now, Ted Kennedy was actually trying to wrest the nomination from Jimmy Carter at the convention. He even flirted with independent candidate John Anderson the week prior and got Anderson to say, if Carter drops out, I'll drop out. And people thought that Kennedy might actually endorse Anderson and not Carter. That didn't happen. But Kennedy gave a big speech at the convention, which was not an I Love Carter speech. It was a my message is awesome speech. And it was a fairly awkward moment. So the bigger Bernie's delegate haul is, there's going to be a whole lot of demands at that point. First and foremost is going to be make Bernie VP or make Elizabeth Warren VP. And that will probably not go over well with the Hillary side because they don't want to have a VP of someone who's not going to be on message with them. They certainly want to have a VP of someone who's a professed Democratic socialist. That's not the message they want to take into swing states. And Warren doesn't say that, but I think Warren would still be someone you can't count on Warren to sign on to your views on trade, for example. That's not, and they don't want to have that kind of problem. Now, a possible compromise pick might be Sherrod Brown, who has endorsed Hillary, very populist, very liberal, from Ohio. But, if Rubio is the nominee, there's going to be a huge push from Latino voters saying, Hillary, you need to have a Latino VP. You need to have Julian Castro, or else Rubio's going to pick up your Latino vote. Now you're in a situation where you're being pressured on multiple sides, which looks like, it probably won't be this bad, but, 1984 with Walter Mondale, it was the spectacle where people were coming to his house to be interviewed and all the interest groups were clamoring for their favorite pick. And it made the nominee look weak, that he was a tool of all these interest groups and not making a strong pick of what you really want to do. So, the bigger Bernie's delegate haul is, the more complication it's for Hillary at that point. Now, I think you're right in that, by and large, people do come home. There isn't that huge an appetite to play spoiler. Even in 2000, it wasn't that many people. What I think is sort of the unknown here is how close will the race be for even a small leakage to matter? And an unknown on top of that is, we have this whole group of under 30 voters who are new voters. And we just don't know how they behave yet, and how their views are being shaped by by the populist fervor in the air. So I think I generally agree with you. I'm not predicting that this means the Democrats will split and Republicans will win with a plurality. But I think there's some wild cards out there to keep an eye on. Should we leave it on that note?
I think we should. I think that's a good note to end it on.
Well, it's been great to talk to you. I haven't touched base with Matt yet. I don't know if he's back in the fold next week or not. Just before we go, how do you spend between now and Tuesday, and where do you go after Tuesday?
I stay in New Hampshire until 6 a.m. Tuesday morning, I want to say. Primaries Tuesday, primaries Monday. I'm like
primaries Tuesday.
All right. Well, so I stay in New Hampshire until 6 a.m. Wednesday morning, when I theoretically fly back to D.C. and, then we do this all over again in South Carolina.
South Carolina's next.
This is primary season. South Carolina's next.
All right.
And then Nevada, and then, who knows? Who knows where this is all headed?
And where can we find your dispatches from the trail?
NationalReview.com, or perhaps more easily on my Twitter feed, which is @Alexis_Levinson.
Excellent. And check out my pieces in Politico this week, the Hillary She's a Liar problem, and the socialists that want Bernie to lose over on the Politico magazine side. This has been the DMZ on bloggingheads.tv, downloadable in podcast form or watchable on video at bloggingheads.tv. Thank you, Alexis Levinson from National Review, and hopefully we'll get Matt Lewis back next week. Take care.
Thanks.